I'm here with Jared Genser, who has a fascinating story overall, but also a fascinating story with the Kennedy School. So I was just saying to him outside, it's like the Kennedy School is this lifelong companion for Jared, and he can, at critical times in his life, he comes back here, and time and again. And he was an MPP here, MPP in the 90s. Before he actually then went to law school, he was an MPP here, and he discovered his true passion here, that human rights law, human rights engagement, engaging around people imprisoned around the world, to do things in support of dissidents, that was his passion. Also realized that an MPP wasn't quite enough to fully act on that passion, so he did something very wise. He combined an MPP with a JD, or he added a JD to an MPP, and then became a human rights lawyer, and has, as a human rights lawyer, done a whole lot of really fascinating things, and by way of advising a lot of international organizations, private sector companies. Anybody who's concerned about being in compliance with human rights law, there's advice available for how to make that happen. He has also made good on this original interest that he found when he was back here in the 90s, engaging with Chinese dissidents and what was happening to them back home. So he actually freed quite a number of people, quite a number of dissidents, and so there's already a movie title for him. So if there is a movie about him, which I think there will be, it will be called The Extractor. The Extractor. So that's actually a term that's been used for Jared, because he has actually extracted quite a number of political prisoners from places around the world. But so about all of that, we could talk for quite some time, but we're not even going to talk about that today, because there's also this yet other side in Jared's work, and that's really what we are here to discuss tonight. This big ongoing theme, challenge in current human rights affairs, namely neurotechnologies, and human rights challenges attached to neurotechnologies. And so maybe with that, Jared, I just turn right over to you. So maybe just explain to us a little bit more. And, there's this audience in the room, and then there's people who, will be watching this later. So let's not assume much, but just kind of walk us through this a little bit. What are neurotechnologies? What are the human rights challenges? But before we do that, maybe join me in giving him a loud round of applause to welcome
him. Well, thank you, Matthias. Thanks for having me. Thanks to the Carr Center for hosting me this year as well as a senior tech fellow. It's great always to be back at the Kennedy School. And first, I just note that this really is the place where my human rights interest took off. Just if I could have a bit of a side distraction story before jumping into neurotech. But it was the fall of 1997, the beginning of my second year of the MPP program, and it was announced that the then president of China, Jiang Zemin, was going to visit campus. And that in and of itself didn't bother me too much, but I learned quite quickly that Harvard was not going to allow any protests on campus, and at least initially, he wasn't going to be taking any questions, which struck me as rather shocking that Harvard would host anyone in that context, given this is an institution best known for facilitating dialogue on any topic one can imagine. And so I got involved in organizing the protests and ended up being like one of the 4 or 5 lead organizers of the protest. And we turned out the largest protest at Harvard since the Vietnam War, more than 5,000 people, which was pretty cool. And along the way, I met some really extraordinary Chinese dissidents who are Harvard students. One of them was a guy named Lobsang Sangay, who was the first Tibetan to be getting a SJD at Harvard Law School. Later, he became the prime minister in exile of Tibet.
You're now.
Oh, okay, great, yeah. And another of my fellow students was Yang Zhanli, who was getting his second PhD at that time at the Kennedy School. He had been in Tiananmen Square and had almost died in a hail of gunfire and managed to barely escape with his life. And that changed his whole worldview and made him decide to spend the rest of his life as a dissident and an activist trying to bring democracy to China. Later, I ended up representing him when he was a political prisoner in China. And in any event, when the protest was over, we were like, well, that was great, but what impact did it have in China? And of course, the CCTV cameras were not pointed at us protesting, but obviously just at the Chinese president. There were a few questions that were asked that were reasonably fine, but one question that was asked of Jiang Zemin was actually a very good question, which was, what do you have to say to the protesters outside? And he smiled and gave a big grin and said, speak louder. And I tried to take that as a personal inspiration. And from there decided I wanted to become a human rights lawyer. And so that's kind of bringing full circle, coming back to my being at the Kennedy School today. It all started here, and I'm back to where it began. So,
and of course, I did forget to mention this, that of course, currently you are a senior fellow here and at the Carr Center, and a few years ago you were
an associate. Yeah.
Also, so that's what I meant by, you kind of keep circling back in, and the Kennedy School keeps circling back in with you, right? That's the relationship we have.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's always wonderful to be back here. A couple of years ago, I met a guy named Dr. Rafael Yuste, who's an MD, PhD at Columbia, one of the world's leading experts on neurotechnology. And in a single 1 hour conversation, I had a discussion that really changed my entire view of the world in a single conversation about what, as a human rights lawyer, I should be focused on and be thinking about in the 21st century and where the world is going. And he shared with me a lot of what was happening, and we'll have this longer discussion today in the field of neurotechnology. And he had a very high-level view of that there are human rights issues at play, but of course had no background in human rights or law, and was simply a extraordinary scientist, doctor, and researcher. And we became fast friends when we realized that we really had highly complementary skills to bring to bear to these issues. So first, let me just define some terms. So neurotechnologies, are devices that can either read, decode, and/or alter brain activity. And neurotechnology devices gather what's referred to as neural data, which is data that measures the activity of the central and peripheral nervous system. There have been many kinds of neurotechnologies that are kind of more widely known about for many, many decades, such as cochlear implants for people who can't hear. It's a neurotech device that decodes sound waves, and then it's put directly into the part of your brain that enables it to be decoded to be able to hear for people who are deaf. And deep brain stimulation is also pretty well known about as well. That helps people, for example, with Parkinson's disease who can't even move because of all the tremors they're facing. And with an implant into the brain, you're able to stop those tremors, and a person can actually function fully normally when those devices are on. And it's always been known that these kinds of devices can have a big impact. But what we've seen in the last 5 years especially is a dramatic expansion from what are implantable devices. And implantable devices require a neurosurgery where a chip is typically put into the human brain. And then various things can be done to decode or even alter brain activity. And there's another category of neurotech devices, which are wearable devices. And the wearable devices is really kind of the biggest focus of our concern, because wearable neurotech devices today are EEG scanners, electroencephalography, and they are very high resolution and gather medical grade neural data. And so a typical brain scan, for example, can be gathering from gigabytes to terabytes of data. And there are now on the market today, and you can go to Amazon right now and buy about 30 products like this. There are now more than 30, but when we did a big study on this last year, we looked at 30 publicly available consumer neurotech products. Right now, the uses are more rudimentary, and we can talk more about kind of what they do, but just in brief before I turn it back to you. These are devices, for example, like a meditation device, where you can, put a wearable brain-computer interface on, and you can meditate for an hour, and then you can look on your app, and the app will tell you when were you actually in a meditative state over that hour. And over time, you can train yourself to remain in a meditative state. There's another device that, for example, enables you to fly a helicopter drone with your thoughts, a very small drone. You can actually train it to decode directions that you're thinking in your mind, and you can actually fly the helicopter drone with your thoughts. And there are lots of other uses, for these kinds of devices. But let me just stop there for now in terms of just defining some terms and talking about what we're talking, what the issues are.
do I understand this correctly? So one version of this technology actually literally does mind reading. It transfers thoughts that are happening in the brain on paper or on the screen, right? This is already happening.
Yeah. So let me first mention what's happening with implantable devices and then what's happening with wearable devices. And it's important to note that anything that can be done with an implantable device can eventually be done with a wearable device. Just there needs to be enough time to further develop the technologies. So there was an extraordinary breakthrough a year ago that was on the front page of the New York Times. Dr. Edward Chang at UCSF out in California not only published a study, but also put out a video of him assisting a woman who was paralyzed and nonverbal. She had a stroke when she was like 30 years old. She's now 50 and had not been able to communicate literally for 20 years, locked in. And also her facial muscles paralyzed as well. And with an implantable brain-computer interface inside her skull, you can now decode thought to text with an implantable device at about 75 words a minute with 90% accuracy. And on top of that, Dr. Chang made an avatar for her that's on now a TV screen that kind of looks like obviously her face. But you can also decode the intended muscle movements that are going to her face. So when you communicate, obviously your brain is also telling your vocal cords how to move, but it's also saying move your facial muscles, your lips, et cetera, to be able to make sounds. And that can also be decoded. And so now she's able to communicate with an avatar that not only replicates her thoughts to text at a very high level of accuracy, but also enables her to for her family to see her face moving as it did before she was paralyzed on this avatar. These devices are now being used or are now being developed in the wearable form. And there was a study in Australia a year ago at an Australian university where with a wearable brain-computer interface, you can now do thought-to-text translation at about 50% accuracy. And it's about 20, 30 words a minute. And it will likely be no more than 2 or 3 years where this will then be possible on a much wider scale and matching the kind of accuracy that we see with implantable devices. And this will be, in my view, the kind of chat GPT moment as it was for generative AI, because the moment that you can do thought to text with a wearable device and you'll see on TV screens all around the world, a person talking to another person, for example, each of them with their thoughts projected onto a screen where they're able to communicate with each other just using their thoughts. And that will be a kind of a big moment. But obviously, this raises enormous human rights risks, which we'll talk about. But yes, thought-to-text translation is not science fiction. It's already science. And to give you a sense of how fast it's going to be coming at you, Apple, 2 years ago now, applied for a patent application for their next generation AirPod, their wearable earbuds, that has built into it EEG scanners in each earbud. And undoubtedly, that will plug into the Apple Watch and health functions there, but they're also setting themselves up to be able to do thought-to-text translation from your iPhone. It will not be more than a few more years before you'll be able to open up a text message and dictate it and send it entirely with your thoughts, wearing their earbuds connected to your phone.
So before turning over to the whole domain of risks that we already see lurking there in the background, is there anything else that you, now that we're getting excited about the excitement domain, that you'd like to put on the table that we should also know before turning over to the risks?
Well, I mean, the developments are not just about decoding. Ultimately, you're talking about altering thoughts. And changing behaviors. And so, again, this is both exciting, but also worrying in a wide array of ways. And so I just mentioned a couple of different experiments to give you a sense of where things are. As I noted before, anything with an implantable device eventually will be able to be done with a wearable device. The same thing goes for smaller animals to larger animals, right? Anything that can be done in a smaller animal today eventually will be able to be done in humans. Now, it's going to take a long time, for example, to get from a mouse to a human, like probably 15, 20 years, but it can ultimately be done. But coming back to my introduction to Dr. Raphael Yuste, he told me about an experiment he did in that 1 hour phone call, which is where I kind of just my jaw dropped. And the experiment that he did was with mice. And it was an experiment where he, in essence, implanted a hallucination into the mouse's brain. And the way that he did that was he taught a mouse to lick a sugar syrup when it saw a little TV screen in front of it with a bunch of black bars that ran from left to right. Then with a with a brain scanning device, with an fMRI brain scanning device. In a mouse's brain, in the visual cortex, mouse's brain, much smaller than human brain, there are about 500 neurons firing when the mouse, and you can actually look down to the level of the individual neuron when the mouse is actually seeing the screen and licking the sugar syrup. And with an implantable brain-computer interface in that spot, you can actually play a mouse's brain like a piano and replicate the exact firing of those 500 neurons when the screen is off. And the mouse then licks the sugar syrup exactly as it does when it's seeing before it the bars moving from left to right. So, beyond that, already with mice, you actually can play a mouse like a marionette. There are experiments that have been done where you can basically take over the mouse's physical movements and tell its hand to move forward and its other one and all of its legs to move basically in sequence to walk. But where we're also heading, and this is really both incredibly exciting and also gives you a sense of kind of where the technology is going, is we're also on the cusp of mental augmentation, right? Of becoming I'm not going to quite say cyborgs, but enhanced humans. And just to give you a couple of examples of what's coming and what's already been able to be done, there was a study at Boston University published a year or two ago on short-term memory in senior citizens. And with external stimulation with a wearable device to the part of your skull underneath which your short-term memory is found, and with like modulated neurostimulation, as it's called, you can actually increase the short-term memory of senior citizens by 40% in their memorization of a list of 20 items. And that effect, their increased short-term memory, lasts for about a month. And again, this is just a small study and it's only about memorizing a list of 20 items, et cetera, but it gives you a sense of, where things may be heading. There are kind of lots of different ways in which this is all going to evolve, but there are other devices that are going to help, especially people with disabilities. Right now, there's a device being developed that, in essence, is working to solve blindness for people who can't see. It's already the case, for example, that you can tap into the signal that your eyes are sending into your optical nerve and actually put it on a TV screen. And it's right now today very rudimentary, and it's mostly just shapes, and you can kind of see what the shapes look like. It's not obviously at all like looking at our reality today, but the expectation is that that technology is going to improve enormously. And there are researchers right now working on an implantable device for someone who is blind that will go, will basically bypass their eyes, because if their eyes aren't functioning, and be able to translate what a camera sees into the same code that would be sent by your eyes into your optical nerve and into your brain, and will be able to then be put right into your brain. The extraordinary thing about the human brain, and I've kind of learned everything I have from Dr. Yuste and other experts on the science and tech. I'm not a science or tech person myself, but the human brain, even if it's never seen anything before, the visual cortex will know what to do with the signal as long as the signal matches what would ordinarily have been sent, because the brain was wired to be able to do it. It just turns out that the person's eyes are not working. So there are going to be lots of kind of things that sound a lot like science fiction coming, but it's fair to say they're well on their way.
So much of the legal protection that we have around privacy comes from a time when violations of privacy amounted to somebody intercepting somebody else's letter and opening the letter to see what's in there. And, that is like the cliche understanding from the analog era of what violations of privacy are, right? And so today, of course, we live in a massively different era. So one way in which this intersects with the work of the Carr-Ryan Center is the work we're doing with Shoshana Zuboff on surveillance capitalism, and you're also involved with that work with us. That there's such a humongous amount of data out there that getting mined in order to make predictions and shaping of the future, that in a way privacy concerns are kind of marginalized, right? So there's kind of an outcrowding concern about privacy concerns in the digital age. But what we are talking about here is still something different, right? So it's not about outcrowding. It's not about overpowering privacy concerns. It's a completely new kind of intrusiveness that we are having here. So it's not about opening the letter that you had to actually put in an envelope first, and then it was kind of tucked away, but it was in principle there. Here it's really about reading the mind. What kind of legal protection do we have there, and what more is needed?
First, let me help you understand the significance of the risk, especially with thought-to-text translation, because the Australian device that I was mentioning earlier does not require the cooperation of the user. If you are thinking of things in the form of words, they can be decoded. And just one of the devices I was mentioning, one of the consumer neurotech products, that is the meditation device that I mentioned. That company talks online about how they've already recorded, and they're keeping for themselves, 100 million hours of neural data coming from brain scans that were taken while people were meditating using their devices. What that means is ultimately when the software technology that comes from the Australian device is perfected, and when it can, using generative AI, have a much higher level of accuracy and speed, there's no reason why this particular company, for example, could not go backwards in time, look at the data that they've recorded, and learn what anybody over those 100 million hours might have been thinking in the form of words while they're meditating. I've meditated before. There are probably certain things I was thinking of as my mind wandered that I might not want decoded. But I
can relate.
So, such is the way of the world. I mean, of course, you have James Joyce's Ulysses, which is a stream of consciousness book, and the last thing on
really
earth that I was
stuff in there, right?
Yeah, exactly. I can only imagine like what the thoughts in the form of words I've been doing over a given day and how my mind flies all over the place would look like in the form of a transcript. But I am absolutely sure I would not want anyone to be able to have access to it. So I mentioned that just to talk about the scale of risk that we're addressing. There are 5 areas of concern that we've identified that are human rights risks associated with this emerging technology in the field of neurotechnology. And they include the need for a right of mental privacy, a right of mental agency, a right of mental identity, a right of non-discrimination in the development and application of these technologies, and a right of fair access to mental augmentation. And what we've done through the foundation that my colleague Ralph and I co-founded together, a nonprofit organization called the Neurorights Foundation, is our first major study was a human rights law gap analysis, where we looked at the 9 international human rights treaties and these 5 risks and mapped these risks against international human rights protections that already were in place today to understand how many of them of these 5 areas of concern might already be addressed by international human rights law, and then, of course, where the gaps are. And there's certain things, for example, if you were to use a neurotech device for the purposes of torture, the definition under the Torture Convention of torture is non-specific as to the means, right? It's about creating severe physical or psychological harm to a person for particular purposes that a government might have. And if it was a neurotech device or physical torture, either way, it would already be outlawed. But you were mentioning that our human rights treaties are quite old. And if you look at the right to privacy under Article 17 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that treaty was drafted in the 1960s. It came into force in the 1970s. And that particular provision was last interpreted by the Human Rights Committee, the treaty body that is authorized to interpret the treaty, in the early 1980s. And the more detailed description of what the right to privacy under international law means is, in essence, a right to be free from arbitrary interference with your privacy, right? Now, that might not cover the passive decoding of a person's thoughts, because you're not necessarily, it would depend on what you did next with that information, but just simply the decoding part wouldn't necessarily interfere with your privacy. Maybe if you then did something with it, then that would interfere.
The act of opening the letter is missing, right? And that
Precisely. So, this is so. I mean, at an international level, one of the things that we need to do is to further interpret international human rights law to ensure that it covers it. Undoubtedly, the people that drafted the treaty, if you think of the concept of interpreting what the drafters intended and what the travaux préparatoire for these treaties are all about, is clearly people are trying to protect privacy in all of its forms. But nobody had imagined in the 1960s about the possibility of one day being able to decode a person's thoughts. If you had asked them back in the 60s, the people who drafted the treaty, and it was then passed by the UN General Assembly and then signed and ratified today by about 175 states around the world, covering 92% of the world's population. If you were to say, well, do you want a person's inner thoughts to be protected? They obviously would have said yes, but nobody had thought about this potential concern. And so so that's one aspect of it. And then there needs to be as well, if you're looking just at mental privacy, for example, and that is our kind of first and top priority, because the decoding technology is the furthest along. If you were to look at, you need to look at national legal and regulatory frameworks and what are various ways to make sure that the global privacy laws and standards would prohibit the misuse and abuse of neural data. And it turns out that neural data, because of its specific characteristics, is not protected for the most part under any global privacy standards. And so what the Neurorights Foundation did in our last big report, which was last year, was we looked at these 30 consumer neurotech products that I was mentioning and the user agreements for them. And we benchmarked those agreements against a half dozen global privacy standards to look across 5 thematic areas of concern and about a dozen different aspects of these agreements to see how do they fare when matched up against global privacy standards. And they fare very poorly across the board. I mean, in fact, all but one of the companies, ironically called Unicorn, and it's the only one that actually protects your privacy rights, keeps your neural data on its device and never uploads it anywhere. But the other 29 companies, they take your neural data and they can do what they want with it. And those 29 companies can sell it to third parties, or use it really for whatever purpose they want. And so I think that this is an enormous area of concern. And when you look at, for example, in the United States, there are now about 30 states that have state-level consumer data privacy laws in place. There's the only federal consumer data that's protected today at the U.S. level is healthcare data and financial data. But when you look at these state laws that protect lots of different kinds of data of consumers, neural data doesn't fall within the existing definitions. And the reason is because neural data is not genetic. It isn't biometric. One day it may be, but today it's not. And it isn't even technically biological. It's actually electrical, because neural data and neurons are firing with electricity. And so one of the things that we've been doing a lot of, and we can talk more about, is working with a number of different states to amend their consumer data privacy laws to explicitly add neural data into the list of protected data and to extend the protections of those privacy laws at the same level of protection that you would have for biometric data and genetic information. And we've done this now in California and in Colorado, and we actually just a week ago had a bill introduced into the Massachusetts legislature to do this here, and we're working with about a half dozen other states.
Let me ask one more thing, and then I'm going to open up to the audience. So in terms of what you would hope for as protection here, and what you're already doing, so if you could say ideally it should be this, what would it be? Would it be an international convention about these particular 5 rights that you mentioned as a separate human rights treaty, binding on signatory states out there in line with other human rights treaties? Is it more something that should be happening domestically, country by country, state by state? So maybe elaborate a little bit on what's happening already and what you are hoping for. Like, if all goes well, what would it be?
So I mean, it's still relatively early days when it comes to the question of how do we properly regulate neural data and its application and use. What I would say is there are a couple of things that need to happen. First is that we need to further interpret international human rights law to have these protections in place. And so, for example, we're advocating to the UN Human Rights Committee, which interprets the treaty that has the right of privacy in it, that it should explicitly amend the general comment that it's published about what the right to privacy is and extend its application to mental privacy, which would then, of course, cover neural data. If you were to do that, because there are 175 countries that have signed and ratified this treaty, covering almost all the world, then there would be an obligation, or at least a strong justification and rationale why all states that sign and ratify this treaty need to amend their domestic law to provide a right of mental privacy in the ways that we're kind of doing country by country and state by state. So I think that there are a number of different treaties that need to be further interpreted in order to provide the protections that are necessary. And so that's kind of a top-down approach, right? Where I think we do need, for example, we were able to get the UN Human Rights Council to adopt a resolution, a first ever resolution on neurotechnology and human rights, and that led to the Human Rights Council Council's advisory committee putting out a first ever report, on this topic, which is about 50, 60 pages long and was very, very well done, identifying the ways in which the UN human rights system needs to be engaging, on these questions and on these issues. And then we need to look at the national and subnational level, I think, around the world. Chile, for example, was the first country in the world to adopt, in their case, a constitutional amendment to protect mental privacy. And they've had their first ever court case go to the Supreme Court, which found that one company in particular that had shipped their product into Chile had violated the right of mental privacy because of the way in which their user agreement harvested neural data, which violated that constitutional right of mental privacy. Few countries, some countries can amend their constitutions relatively easily. Most can't. So in certain contexts, a constitutional amendment makes sense. In other cases, national legal and regulatory changes can be helpful. For the time being, I don't think we need an international convention. At the moment, I think ultimately we probably will, and ultimately we'll probably need a regulatory agency at a global level, like the International Atomic Energy Agency, to work on these issues as they become much more widespread and broad. But for example, when we look at issues like mental augmentation, we're literally kind of right in the earliest days of seeing where mental augmentation is heading, both in terms of improving our the kind of innate skills that we have, but also then changing behavior. I'll give you one example of a device that's currently being that's based on mice experimentation that's being used in humans and will likely be very, very effective. But it turns out that in a mouse, if you see a mouse that is very overweight, that mouse has in its brain, from a brain scan, a gorge impulse that lights up when it sees a big piece of cheese, for example. And if you put a implantable chip in that spot in mouse's brain, when it has that gorge impulse, you can actually disrupt all those firing neurons, and then the mouse just walks away from the cheese and the mouse loses weight. There's now an experiment being done with humans, same kind of thing. Humans have gorge impulses as well. And there's every reason to expect that this study that's currently underway will prove to be a very effective way of managing weight as well, within that particular case, rather than than taking, medicine, which is now becoming much more widely available with an implantable, chip. And that's about kind of behavior change. But there are also some extraordinary things coming, which are much further down the road, but are worth mentioning here, because when I talk about kind of next generation humans, this is really where it goes to. It turns out that it's long been the case, actually, for deep brain stimulation, that there's a very, very, very small percentage of people who have deep brain stimulation who have a unintended side effect from that brain stimulation, which is a personality change of some kind or another. And there's a very famous case of a woman who, with deep brain stimulation, which stopped her Parkinson's, she actually went from being an introvert to being an extrovert. And her family at first didn't recognize her. And she used to be not quite a shut-in, but someone who was very happy at home by themselves, etc. But with the device on, she's a totally different person. Life of the party, funny, happy, out there in the world, right? And she likes her new self. And so, the question becomes, right now, because of the, and literally if you turn off, the implantable device that's stopping her tremors, she goes back to her prior personality. And so because of the specific nature of this particular unintended side effect, scientists are studying her intensely, because if you can decode what happens differently in her brain with the device on and off, and you're able to figure out what neurons fire for a person who's an extrovert versus an introvert, then you, at some point, again, down the road, you would be able to implant the device in a person's mind in the right place and stimulate your neurons and become an extrovert. But if you think about like a dozen or 15 personality traits that we are we altruistic or not? Are we, are we friendly or not? And these kinds of things, you could imagine a future where you're able to decode various personality traits and potentially change who you are, not through, psychotherapy and medication, but like with a snap of the fingers and an implantable device. And so, for example, you're talking about regulation. Right now, we're just beginning to think about like, what is it going to mean to regulate mental augmentation? Privacy concerns, those are very easy to explain to people and understand. Decoding thought to text, you could see immediately, you don't have to be an expert on anything. most people are very worried about mental privacy. In fact, if you look at the laws that we were able to get passed, for example, in California, the law in California was passed unanimously by the state house and the state senate, signed by law and the governor. Same in Colorado, with one no vote in the state legislature there. That was from someone voting no on everything, but therefore, essentially unanimous. And that's in Montana, just passed a law through their state senate, passed unanimously. And it's because you could explain to someone, you could decode your thoughts to text. And do you want people to have access to that other than you? And pretty much 99.999% of people, regardless of their political affiliation, is going to say that's really a bad idea. But when you start talking about these kinds of mental augmentation issues, it is a lot more complicated. And we're just at the beginning of thinking what a global legal and regulatory framework might look like. And fair access is also huge, because mental augmentation is also going to be a driver of extraordinary further inequality that we have in the world between the have and have nots. I mean, we're here at the Kennedy School. Imagine, you're here on a scholarship and, don't have a lot of extra money lying around, and you've got a fellow student who managed to come from a family with a lot of resources, and, you can buy a very expensive device to help with your memory, and you're the scholarship student and you can't afford it. And do you want to be taking stats, for example, here, which was a pleasure cruise for me, among other things?
But he still loves it.
Exactly. I was the glutton for punishment who placed myself into advanced stats, even though I'd never taken it before, and suffered through 2 semesters of it. But not my favorite class after that. But I did learn a lot. But imagine if you can, if some students are able to have the ability to augment their memory and others aren't. I mean, and how is that going to impact outcomes for education around the world? And how do we regulate that? How do we deal with that? I mean, these are huge issues that are only a little bit beyond the horizon.
Floor is open for questions. Yes, Judith.
Jared, thank you so much. I don't think
It's being recorded, so I think.
So we discuss all the possibilities of expanding privacy rights, constitutional amendments, legislative reform, domestically, internationally, introducing international treaties where relevant. But then we talk about mental augmentation. So it really is a question of how do you legally strike the balance between allowing mental augmentation, which is immensely helpful. Like I'm thinking like 20 years ago, my grandfather suffered from dementia, as many of our grandparents suffered from dementia, leading to sometimes Alzheimer's or vice versa. And I mean, mental augmentation, I can tell you unanimously, we would have all consented to some form of device that would have helped my grandfather live longer, more healthily, etc. So these are very positive outcomes in the mental augmentation side. And then we have serious concern on the privacy side about protecting infringements on your neural rights. So I would see it as, if I had to make a recommendation, introducing legislation domestically and internationally, which would be an alternative. But my key concern here is how do you strike that balance between protecting and preserving the neural rights privacy aspect, and then striking the right balance to allow the mental enhancement to occur for those who really need it. Example, Parkinson's, as you stated earlier.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a key question. I mean, the reality is that today there are no cures for any brain diseases. And at the very best and very rudimentary ways, all you can do is slow their progression. And my colleague Raphael Yuste would tell you that one day we're going to be able to not just stop their progression, but ultimately cure brain diseases. Decades, probably 2-3 decades until that happens. But neurotech devices will be the key to unlocking those advances. And the only way we get to those neurotech devices is by gathering large quantities of neural data from people in lab conditions to be able to conduct the research, to be able to develop the innovations that we all want to come. The reality is that 1 in 4 people in the world at some point in their lives will be diagnosed with a neurological disease. And the impact, the financial impact of that is astronomical, especially when you're talking about dementia, Alzheimer's, and other diseases. So it's where we are today in terms of, let's say, what the Neurorights Foundation is focused on is, we're really only at the very beginning of protecting mental privacy. And that's, an urgent priority because of the reasons I've described. Undoubtedly, we're going to need to deal with all the other, the other 4 areas that I mentioned: mental identity, which relates to potentially, augmentation of your personality, mental agency and like having control over your own future, ensuring non-discrimination, the development and application of neurotech. All those are also areas of enormous concern as well. I think it's going to be a balancing act, and it's going to be hard to strike that balance. And the reason it's going to be hard to strike that balance is because today you can only decode about 1% of what's in a neural data that's done by a scanning device. And ultimately, one day my colleague would tell you that you're not going to just be able to decode your active thoughts, but you're going to actually be able to decode your subconscious thoughts as well. And so, there are huge implications for how this plays out. I think the primary thing is that, and one of the things that we're struggling with as a foundation and we're working on right now, I mean, number one, we're working with a number of private sector neurotech companies to develop a model user agreement for, how do we develop a user agreement that's compliant with international best practice when it comes to, consumer data privacy rights, so that because our conclusion from our report looking at 30 consumer neurotech companies wasn't that they're all terrible actors. They're sucking out your brain data. Most of them were many of them are startups, undoubtedly probably well-intentioned with no money for lawyers and just kind of taking things off the shelf and not giving it a lot of thought. So we want to kind of provide a positive example of how to go about doing this. Undoubtedly, one of the things that we have to struggle with, including with these companies, some of which are actually being used by researchers in labs today, is how do we inform users of these devices or potential research subjects of the risks of what you might be giving away if you agree to consent to having your brain scanned, when today you can only decode about 1% of what's in there, and we don't know yet what's in there. And one of the biggest things that one looks at when it comes to sharing of consumer data of any kind with researchers or doctors or companies or the government, right, is what informed consent as to what is it that you're giving away, and having people be able to make conscious choices about whether or not to share their data. And when you can't really de-identify neural data fully, meaning that we don't know fully what's in there and how much will be able to be decoded and whether it will ultimately be able to type back to you or not, it's very difficult to explain to an ordinary person, I think, in let's say a user agreement, what they're giving away if they agree to consent. So I think, this is going to be something we're going to continue to struggle with. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, the mission of the Neurorights Foundation begins by talking about the promotion of emerging neurotechnologies, but then of course it turns to protection from its misuse or abuse. But promote we obviously my colleague Rafael Yuste, who runs the neurotech lab at Columbia and has spent his whole life working with this working in this field, his whole life is dedicated to medical science and to innovation, and to put these kinds of devices to exactly the kind of use that you were talking about. So I think it's going to be a struggle, and there will be pushback, I think, from a lot of different directions. It's why I don't think, but I do think that what we can't allow is what's happening right now with these consumer devices, which is, unmitigated brain harvesting with no information really being provided to consumers at all about what it is they're giving up and how that data might be used in the future.
Freddie, let's go to the back.
Hi.
Thank you. Hey, Jared, how are you?
I'm glad to see you safe and well.
Yeah, thank you very much.
This is one of the most prominent Venezuelan opposition political leaders and
Jared
former political prisoner.
And Jared supported also my freedom. So thank you, Jared. Yeah. And many others, so I have this is amazing, really. And I am glad that someone like you is in this field, really. I have many questions. One would be what would you answer to someone who would say, okay, what's the difference between the student having a mental enhancement versus someone that has a better computer or access to internet in other areas, right? That's one question that I have. And the second one is, I have many, but
sure.
The second one is, I assume if this is a very recent topic of discussion, at least not mainstream, in this part of the world, do you have any information about what's happening in China or any other non-free societies with this topic?
Yeah. Well, both important questions. I think in terms of the first question, it's a matter of degree. That's about the best answer I can give, because obviously there are already enormous disparities between people based on their ability to afford to even pay for tuition to go to a school or not, or to have access to computers or not, or mobile telephony or not. So undoubtedly that's all there. I think that my narrow point was just simply that this is going to exacerbate that the gap that is already there, and that it needs to be actively managed. I do think there's something fundamentally different about neural data as compared to anything else that defines us as humans, because it's our brain and our minds that literally defines everything of who we are. It defines our personality. It defines our relationships with other people and our family. It defines, included in our neural data are our hopes and our dreams and our ambitions, and what do we want to achieve in the world, and what kind of impact do we want to have. All of that is captured in this extraordinary organ, the human brain. And so gathering data from that organ and decoding it could not be, this is not a human rights issue. I don't know what would be a human rights issue, because of the enormous sensitivity and importance of the human mind and the human brain. With respect to your latter question in terms of what's going on around the world and other places, the modern kind of neurotech movement was initially sparked by President Obama, that created the Brain Initiative. And this was in 2014. And U.S. has been investing about $500–600 million a year into primary research, primarily in the United States, universities, hundreds and hundreds of locations. Money through the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, and of course through DARPA, the Defense Department's research arm. China is investing $1 billion a year through their military in developing neurotech products. Obviously, we have no idea what they're doing, but there are a lot of worrying things that are being developed. One thing that I'll just note that's coming undoubtedly is an unbeatable lie detector test. Lie detectors today can be beaten, but it turns out our foundation worked actually with Werner Herzog, the documentary filmmaker, to do a new documentary called Theater of Thought, which is now premiering across the US in individual theaters and will be to a streamer near you soon. But in that documentary, my colleague Rafa was with Werner Herzog, and at the lab of the designer and developer and CEO of a company that has created the kind of most high-level brain scanning device available that uses optical lasers, and is, today the EEG scanner is relatively rudimentary in terms of brain scanning devices, but this wearable device that comes from the company Kernel, which is called their Flow device, is the equivalent of an MRI machine that's usually about $1 million, $750,000 to $1 million in a wearable device. Right now, it's a business-to-business device for decoding, and it's about $50,000. But eventually, we're going to get to a much, much higher level of resolution with wearable devices. And wearing one of these devices in the lab, we used it as a lie detector, and we had our colleague Rafa say things that were absolutely true and things that were not true, but on the same issue. So he was asked, is 1 + 1 3, right? And he said, no, the first time. You see what it looks like telling the truth, and then you say yes. Totally different parts of the brain all being stimulated when you're lying versus telling the truth. And so this device, as one illustration, is likely going to be able to do that. I'm most worried, and I know you would be as well, about the potential uses of these kinds of devices for torture. Obviously, a person could always be physically tortured, but the problem is that of course, the development of emerging technologies are neutral when it comes to morality and how they might be used. And right now, there are implantable devices that are being used for people with chronic pain syndrome, where they have misfiring neurons that creates pain in part of their body. Kind of the most famous example of this, of course, is a person who's lost a limb and they feel pain in their arm, but they don't have an arm, right? So right now, it can only assist people with a more mild form of the disease. The most severe form of the disease is called CPRS, chronic regional pain syndrome. And it's called the suicide disease because people who have it are experiencing the greatest pain a human can feel on a regular basis. And there's nothing that can be done to stop it. And 80% of people with this disease commit suicide. Right now, as they're advancing the implantable devices, right, they're going to ultimately be able to cure CPRS, which is going to be an extraordinary development. But once you've learned how to turn off all the neurons, you can turn on all the neurons, right? And as I said before, as a general rule of thumb, any device that can be that can work in an implantable form will eventually be able to be used in a wearable form, which means we are a number of years away, but ultimately will have the equivalent of a wearable brain-computer interface that could be put on somebody, and you could literally flip a switch, and they would feel the maximum pain that a human being could feel. So these are the things that I'm worried about as a human rights lawyer, most especially, is how can these devices be misused or abused. But the reality is that in China, there's misuse or abuse already occurring, both in schools and actually in factories. And so there's a very prominent case from 2019 you can find online, and you can see the videos of this, and it's kind of stunning, of a US company called BrainCode that has a concentration device that measures if you're concentrating or not. And this device was used in Chinese schools in a pilot program, and kids were given wearable devices that would show green when they were concentrating and red when they were not concentrating. Perhaps you might want to deploy this here at the Kennedy School. Basically at the end of every week, the kids were ranked by the amount of time that they were concentrating or not. And this was made public to the class, and it was sent out to all the parents. And there was an outcry in China protesting parents, and actually they stopped it as a pilot. But this is already these concentration devices are being used in Chinese factories already. And basically, if you're a line worker and you're not concentrating consistently well, you're going to get fired from your job. Now, there are certain places in which the concentration device is a good thing. For example, this is being deployed in the workplace, for example, with long-haul truckers in the US and around the world, which are devices that can detect if you're starting to emit the brainwave patterns of being tired or even more sleepy, right? And then those are devices for long-haul truck drivers that put an alarm on, that like an out loud alarm for the person driving, saying you're now starting to appear drowsy, and a message is also sent back to your company saying the person is drowsy as well. And this is a very good use, I think. I mean, obviously, if you're going to be a long-haul truck driver, your job is to stay awake driving your truck, and I don't think truck drivers should have much of a concern about having their brainwaves decoded for the purposes of safety. However, there are privacy issues there as well, because the very same devices that are being used, these are the EEG scanners. Today, an EEG scanning device that are being used in all these consumer neurotech products can actually determine if you have any of a number of different brain diseases, and can actually already today decode if you have about a dozen different brain states. Are you angry? Are you happy? Or you're sad? So one issue, which again, reasonable people could have different points of view, is that, long-haul truckers wearing these devices, the companies in question could use that very same data that's getting taken for a narrow purpose of sleep, but they could also, for example, determine if you had epilepsy. Now, it may not be a big deal in the case of a long-haul truck driver, because you probably don't want a long-haul truck driver who has epilepsy. I mean, I'm not, obviously I oppose discriminating against people with disabilities, but there are certain kinds of jobs and certain kinds of diseases that I don't think people are especially well suited for. But we are going to see a huge emergence of neurotech in the workplace as well. So the very long answer to your short question, Freddie, is I am really scared about what's coming when it comes to how dictators can misuse and abuse this tech. The genie is already out of the bottle. It's going to happen, and the question is, how do we deal with it? But the reality is that I am sure that dictators around the world are going to want to access this. You also asked just last. To round it out, you also asked about other parts of the world where this technology is not as well known. The reality is today about 80% of neurotech is being developed and funded in the United States. It's growing much more globally, and there are brain initiatives in countries all around the world. The European Union has one, Japan, South Korea. There's a European I said the European Brain Initiative. Israel has a brain initiative as well. So there are lots of countries that are starting to put money into primary research and development. Again, I think as this kind of technology becomes much more visible and starts to grow exponentially, I mean, for example, once you deploy a thought-to-text translation device in an Apple iPhone and AirPods, for example, and they sell like 100 million of these a year, everybody in the world is going to know what neurotech is, and that means you're going to have a massive influx of investment and technological developments, and these will be both amazing and about as scary as it can come.
One last question.
Hi, Jared. It's so great to see you here.
Seeing you too.
So building on your fears about how dictators could misuse this, I can see how criminals could absolutely misuse this. So think about human trafficking. There are 27 million people at least trafficked last year, and they were trafficked by force, coercion, and there's a lot of security in place to make sure that the people you've trafficked. But imagine if we do the reverse of the technology we're talking about, where instead of inflicting torture, you're actually able to kind of switch the reward center. So someone who is being sexually trafficked finds it to be a pleasurable experience and actually wants to do it. So just imagine, I mean, I'm imagining the horrible things that could come out of this technology and how people could actually be, you don't even have to brainwash people. You don't have to have security to make people do whatever you want. You could literally have an implantable device given to them without necessarily their consent, and you can make them do whatever they want to do. So it's very lucrative is what I'm thinking. And because the economic incentives are aligned in this direction, where it's going to be potentially really lucrative for criminals, how do we prevent that kind of future? Because that's like a dystopian future, using this technology.
I mean, there are lots of scary ways in which these kinds of technologies could be developed. I mean, I was mentioning earlier, for example, the experiment currently underway with weight loss and disrupting a person's gorge impulse. You could imagine, I mean, there are horror stories of parents trying to deprogram, their LGBTQ kids, who are obviously, have their own sexual identity and it's natural and normal. And the reality is that, parents with a child like that could literally, presumably against their child's will, stop a person who's LGBTQ from not stop them from being their identity, but stop them from acting on the sexual urges that they might have, right? So you could find, because similarly, sexual urges can also be narrowed down in the human brain, and you can see what's lighting up when you have a sexual urge, and you could disrupt a kid's sexual urges, for example, and so you could stop them from acting on their ordinary, normal attraction that they might have. And I mean, that to me is again, horrifying. And there are lots of those scenarios that, based on the existing technology today, one could see. So, I mean, this is where ultimately I do think we get to the need for international treaty. It's where we do get to, international legal and regulatory agency. And I think that, the world is not ready for everything else to come out of Pandora's box. But the box is open and things are coming out of it already in different directions. Right now, it's privacy. But I mean, we're on the cusp of both an incredibly exciting as well as somewhat dystopian future. I mean, I think anything that, as I said, can be used for good can be used for ill as well.
It really is brave new world, if ever there was one, right? I mean, this was all very powerful, really, Jared. What you've done in this last hour with us. I mean, the utopian potential of this became very visible. I mean, the just potential for people who had strokes and kind of improvements there. Amazing. Other utopian potential there, of course, comes with a lot of question marks, right? So we do certain augmentation, right? Of course, big debate in medical ethics what the demarcation actually is between augmentation, enhancement, right, and therapy treatment, and these mechanisms that you alluded to, that once somebody does that, once we get that for our kids, once in that professional role, some people do it. What does it say if you don't do it, and what disadvantage do you have if you don't do it, and what does this do for inequality in around countries? So even the utopian potential comes with lots of question marks, right? But the dystopian potential is very pronounced. So I think you emphasized this somewhere, which lawmaker in a democratic society wouldn't say yes to regulating this once it's clear what this is about. But of course, we've also heard in the questions, I mean, the attraction in dictatorial and authoritarian regimes would be enormous, and not just in authoritarian regimes, but also just what's going on right now in the American government about replacing large segments of the administration, of the bureaucracy, with apparently the next step would be to bring loyalists in, right, to make that foolproof. This
not
technology.
Lawyers.
Sorry,
not lawyers.
Not lawyer. Yeah. So it's and the commercial potential in all of this. So it's overwhelming. So what we have there. So, but I guess this makes us very lucky that you are working on this, and we have to make our contribution to get the word out about this, so that there is more interest in this. Any concluding thoughts for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a really good discussion. I think everywhere I go, I'm talking about this. This is the only thing people want to talk to me about. I mean, as much as I want to talk about a lot more my political prisoner cases, for example, everyone wants to turn to this aspect of my work, and I think it's because people want to understand what's coming and the exciting developments, as well as how do we think about those downside risks. Overall, as a human rights lawyer, I'm an optimist. I wouldn't have become a human rights lawyer if I didn't believe we could make the world a better place. I mean, it's obviously people who are destroying the world, and in the same way as people using our brains and our minds, we can transform the world for the better. And I think all we can do is just keep working at it, try to break it down in bite-sized pieces, like just talking about mental privacy and what are all the various, I mean, that's complicated, but you can kind of get your arms around it, start to think about what to do about it internationally, nationally, et cetera. And then there's a lot of things that can be done. And we're going to have to take the emerging neurotech and where it's all coming and do the same thing, as we go forward. But, what I fear is that we don't want to go, in my view, in the direction of AI, where now there's like 100 global standards around it, and really kind of a million things happening in lots of different directions, and really with very little to no, I think, understanding by most people about where it is, where it's heading, and how do we manage it. And so this is why we're trying to really get ahead of things when it comes to neurotech, and looking at, before it breaks through into the public eye, having put in place a lot of different kinds of protections at the international and national level that can at least impede the worst misuses of the tech among most people, right? And I think that's about the best that we can do, while also obviously embracing the upside potential.
Please join me in thanking Jared.